In 1942, the world was deep in the turmoil of World War II. German forces, having already conquered significant parts of Europe, turned their attention eastward, launching a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. This operation, known as Operation Barbarossa, was marked by speed and surprise. The Germans aimed to capture vast territories quickly, believing they could deliver a decisive blow to the Soviet Union. Amidst the chaos of war, another, more insidious weapon was at play: famine. This tactic was not as visible as tanks rolling across fields or planes bombing cities, but it was equally devastating. In the Soviet Union, especially in Ukraine, the use of starvation was a calculated maneuver by the German command. The Germans sought to undermine Soviet resistance by cutting off food supplies and controlling access to resources. Ukraine was particularly hard hit. Known as the breadbasket of Europe before the war, it was rich in wheat and other agricultural products. However, as the German army advanced, they would confiscate grain and livestock, leaving local populations with little to eat. Villagers, already struggling, faced the double burden of war and hunger. Many were forced to watch as their crops were taken and their loved ones starved. The situation was dire, and the death toll began to rise. Small farmers and rural communities bore the brunt of this strategy. People who had once been self-sufficient found themselves reliant on a dwindling supply of food. As the summer heat turned to fall and winter approached, starvation became a harsh reality. Families shared whatever they had, and some were pushed to desperate measures for survival. Reports of malnutrition and starvation began to circulate among the Allied nations. But the full extent of the famine in Ukraine was not fully understood outside the region. For those trapped in the conflict, each day became a struggle to find enough to eat. Many children were particularly vulnerable. Their health deteriorated rapidly with little to no access to nourishment. The bread that once filled their tables became a cruel memory. This strategic use of famine as a weapon shows how war can take many forms. While battles and military conquests dominated headlines, the suffering caused by starvation and deprivation was also a significant part of the war experience. The German approach highlighted a cold calculation: to weaken the enemy not just through military might, but by attacking their very ability to sustain themselves. In time, the Soviet leadership would respond to these tactics with their own strategies, aiming to rebuild and support those in famine-stricken areas. However, the scars left on the people of Ukraine would last long beyond the war. As the fighting continued into 1943 and beyond, the harsh realities of hunger remained intertwined with the broader narrative of conflict, suffering, and resilience. Ukrainian peasants faced terrible food shortages during the German invasion. As the German army advanced, they began requisitioning grain, livestock, and other essential food supplies from local farmers. This strategy not only weakened the resistance, but also aimed to feed the German troops. With each passing day, Ukraine's rich agricultural fields, once filled with plenty, became empty and barren for the people who lived there. Families who relied on their crops for sustenance found themselves in desperation. The Germans took away the food that should have fed the locals, leaving them with little to survive on. Villagers watched helplessly as their animals were taken and their harvests disappeared, often with no compensation. People who had once traded and shared food within their communities now faced the harsh reality of hunger. The devastating impact of these requisitioning tactics went largely unnoticed by those living outside of Ukraine. While headlines in other countries focused on military movements and battles, the silent suffering of these farmers remained hidden. For many, it was hard to imagine the extent of the crisis. The images of soldiers plundering fields did not convey the full human cost of these actions. Farmers struggled to feed their families. Many people grew weaker as they faced constant food shortages. Children, the most vulnerable in this situation, often went to bed hungry. Reports of starvation began to trickle out, but they rarely captured the grim reality on the ground. Those in power outside Ukraine didn't fully understand the depth of the crisis. They may have seen numbers reflecting food shortages, but they couldn't see the faces of suffering families. As the years went on, many peasants resorted to desperate measures. Some scavenged for wild plants or tried to find scraps in abandoned fields. Others exchanged what little possessions they had left for food. This was a hard life, filled with daily struggles to find enough to eat, yet the spirit of resilience in many communities remained strong. The strategy used by the Germans was a brutal way to maintain control. While it served their immediate military goals, it left lasting scars on the Ukrainian population. This cruel aspect of warfare showed how conflicts could inflict suffering beyond the battlefield, changing lives forever in the most unexpected and tragic ways. As the war dragged on, the situation for the people in Ukraine became increasingly dire. Reports started to emerge about mass deaths due to starvation and disease. Cities like Kiev, once vibrant with life, began to face a grim reality. Streets that were filled with families, workers, and children now showed a different scene. Bodies scattered across the ground, left behind as hunger and illness took their toll. Each death told a story of suffering and desperation. Families torn apart, loved ones lost, and communities crumbling under the weight of despair. People in other parts of the world began to hear about these tragedies. News outlets slowly picked up the reports, sharing the horrifying images and statistics that highlighted the scale of the crisis. However, the Nazi regime tried to control the narrative. Officials dismissed these reports as mere propaganda, insisting that the stories were exaggerated or completely false. They portrayed the reports as attempts by their enemies to undermine the German efforts in the East. This denial further complicated the situation, as the true extent of the suffering remained shrouded in confusion. Despite the regime's claims, the reality on the ground was stark. Civilians were dying from neglect, disease spread through crowded living conditions, and food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. For many, there was a growing recognition that this was more than just collateral damage in a military campaign. It was a calculated strategy aimed at breaking the spirit of the Ukrainian people. As the world began to understand the horrors faced by the civilians, some leaders tried to call attention to the plight of those suffering. However, the full impact of the regime's actions became harder to communicate. With so many lies circulating from the Nazi officials, it was difficult for people outside Ukraine to grasp the extent of the tragedy. In Kiev and other affected cities, survivors lived in constant fear, not just of bombs and bullets, but of starvation and disease. Each day brought new challenges as people struggled to care for their families amidst chaos. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, many held on to hope, trying to survive and support one another, even as the world struggled to comprehend their suffering. By 1943, the human toll of the war in Ukraine became impossible to ignore. Reports of mass starvation and disease were no longer just distant whispers. They had turned into urgent cries for help. International organizations and foreign governments began to pay closer attention as images and testimonials poured in from the region. Photographs of skeletal children and families digging through trash for food shocked many who had remained unaware of the harsh reality. As people learned more about the devastation, a growing wave of outrage spread across the globe. Activists, journalists, and humanitarian workers shared stories that revealed the true extent of suffering caused by the Nazi regime's strategies. Eyewitness accounts came from brave individuals who risked everything to bring attention to the crisis, recounting how families struggled to survive day by day. The silence that had surrounded this hidden weapon of war, the use of famine as a tactic, began to break down. Calls for investigations into the humanitarian disaster started to grow louder. Organizations like the Red Cross and various humanitarian groups pushed for action, demanding that the world recognize the atrocities occurring in Ukraine and elsewhere in occupied territories. As pressure mounted, there were discussions among allied nations about how to respond. Governments that had previously focused primarily on the military aspects of the war began to understand that human suffering was just as critical to address. Politicians, journalists, and the public expressed their outrage, urging leaders to take decisive action. However, the Nazi regime continued to downplay the situation, labeling the information coming out as mere propaganda. They tried to maintain a facade of control and success. Yet, the weight of truth was growing heavier, and the stories of suffering were becoming too numerous to dismiss. As the world began to pay attention, it also faced difficult questions about moral responsibility. Would nations intervene to help those in need? Would they hold the perpetrators accountable? The humanitarian crisis in Ukraine forced many to confront the impact of war on civilians and the urgent need for international solidarity in times of desperation. As the war progressed and Soviet forces began to push back against the Germans, they uncovered horrifying truths about the tactics used by the Nazi regime. During their advances, soldiers stumbled upon mass graves scattered across the countryside and in the outskirts of cities. The chilling sights revealed a grim reality of the war that went beyond the battles fought with guns and bombs. These mass graves told stories of despair and suffering. Bodies lay in the earth, some in groups, others alone, each one representing a life lost due to the starvation tactics employed by the Nazis. The evidence was clear and deeply disturbing. The soldiers found not only the dead, but also remnants of the famine that had devastated entire communities. Ripped away from their homes, families had been left to perish in silence. As the Soviet forces documented these findings, the implications of the tragedy began to resonate. It became evident that this was a strategy designed to weaken the Soviet Union by targeting its civilians and crippling its ability to resist. This tactic of using hunger as a weapon was calculated and cruel, showcasing a level of brutality that many had struggled to comprehend. The discovery of the graves sparked outrage among the Soviet troops as well as in the broader world. It served as a stark reminder that the horrors of the war were not confined to the battlefield. The civilians, often caught in the crossfire of political and military strategies, were paying an unimaginable price. As the evidence of such inhumanity continued to emerge, it marked a dark chapter in the war. The brutality of the German command could not be ignored any longer. People began to understand the depth of cruelty that had accompanied the Nazi invasion. This revelation spurred not only anger, but also a renewed sense of urgency among Allied nations to hold those responsible accountable. The uncovering of these mass graves became a rallying point. It reinforced the idea that war's impact extended far beyond soldiers. It shattered families and communities. The pain and loss endured by the Ukrainian people, along with many others affected by the war, would not quickly be forgotten. The past had laid bare the consequences of unchecked power and hatred, shaping the memories of those who lived through this harrowing time. In the aftermath of World War II, as nations began to piece together the destruction and devastation, the full impact of the silent weapon, the use of famine as a tactic, became starkly clear. War tribunals were established to hold accountable those who had orchestrated such inhuman strategies. During these trials, evidence emerged, showcasing the grim realities faced by civilians in occupied territories. The testimonies and documents revealed a tragic combination of military strategy and brutal mistreatment of innocent people. Historians and researchers dove deep into these events, trying to understand how such horrors could unfold. They highlighted the calculated decisions made by Nazi commanders that transformed famine into a weapon. The analysis of these actions became crucial in recognizing how warfare could extend beyond the battlefield and impact the lives of countless innocents. The tragic consequences of these tactics came to symbolize the darker sides of warfare. People began to reflect on the catastrophic human cost of using starvation as a means to achieve military goals. The images and stories of suffering from places like Ukraine became a somber reminder of the depths to which humanity could sink in times of conflict. This recognition served as a powerful lesson for future generations. It emphasized the importance of protecting civilians in times of war and reminded leaders of the ethical responsibilities that come with power. The brutal reality of the silent weapon became a case study in international humanitarian law, influencing how nations approached the treatment of non-combatants in conflicts. While the physical scars of the war would eventually fade, the memories of the tragedy remained etched in the hearts of survivors and their families. Their stories urged the world not to forget the lessons learned from that dark period. As discussions about human rights gained momentum, the legacy of those who suffered during the war would shape conversations for decades to come, highlighting the enduring need for empathy, accountability, and the protection of human dignity in times of strife.